Good morning. Thank you everybody for coming. My name is Jesse Alexander Lopez and I'm the librarian here at the Phoenix Art Museum and part of the Jean and Kathy Women Art Research Library. I really appreciate this turnout. The last time I tried to have an event, there was zero. So it was very early on, like coming back from COVID, so things have changed. And it's great to see everyone here. Yeah. So sort of the origin of this talk is that this fall, the Phoenix Art Museum has several different Japanese-related art exhibitions going on, both contemporary, being like Mr. and Still Gallery with like manga and all of that rolled into it. And then the Asian Gallery is having a reinstall this December. So there's going to be a totally different new set of beautiful Japanese-related folk art in there, which Janet is going to talk about. Also, like how the library, if you are aware, has a space in Ballinger Gallery called Streets and Avenues. That space is being extended until February, so you have more of a chance to go check that stuff out if you haven't seen it. The premise of that is mostly Chicano and Mexican street and folk art, and it was connected to Desert Rider, which closed before Mister. And along with Janet's reinstall, the library is getting a space in Lions Hall, like the hallway that connects the museum proper to like Palette. And that exhibition is going to be called Kakahashi, Books as Bridges. And that word in Japanese means bridge building in a metaphorical sense. So the idea is I'm going to use that space to try to connect the contemporary Japanese art of Mr. with Janet's space, and we have this nice physical hallway to do that. And I think it's going to be really cool, and we have a lot of really interesting material. Part of this talk is connected to the book club meeting that's happening after. It's for a book called The Beauty of Everyday Things by Soetsu Yanagi. It's a really interesting book and was sort of the light that clicked for me to put all this together with Janet and the Japanese Friendship Garden. So I also, just to take care of administrative business, I need to mention to guests of the museum that are not members, you need to go buy a ticket if you want to go to the museum afterwards at the front desk. This is a free event, but only free for this. And finally, before I do introductions, if this is cool and you like it, and you stick around for the book club, on January 21st, Saturday, January 21st, there's going to be the next book club event, and we're going to do all the promotional material for that. But the book is called Oishinbo, and it's a manga about the essentials of Japanese cooking. But it's really, really cool. It's a multi-series book, and we're working on programming to have a lecture to tie in with it, like we're doing right now. So that'll be Saturday, January 21st. I also have to do a huge shout out to Masahiro Yamamoto from the Japan Outreach Initiative, who was instrumental in arranging this and connecting the museum with Keiko sensei. So deep gratitude, thank you very much. So our first speaker of the afternoon, I'll give you the two speakers' short bios and release it to the speaker, and then please hold any questions to after both of them have spoken. So, Dr. Janet Baker has served as Curator of Asian Art at Phoenix Art Museum for 22 years.
Is that okay?
In that time, she has developed a collection to include 16 cultures of Asia and doubled the total number of objects in the Asian collection. Her interests are varied and include the study of Buddhist art, Chinese funerary art, Japanese and Chinese ceramics and painting, and most recently, Sikh art. She enjoys the vast geographical and historical traditions of Asia, as well as how contemporary artists are engaged in creating work that embraces their personal heritage, while also becoming a part of global art culture. After she speaks, we're deeply honored to have a special guest brought to us by a great relationship with the Japanese Friendship Garden, Keiko Nakada, Urasenke, Chado instructor of Urasenke Tankokai. So without further ado, Dr. Janet Baker.
Thank you, Jesse. And thank you, everyone, for coming today. Irashimase, hajime nashite. As Jesse mentioned in his introduction, currently the Asian Gallery is undergoing a major transformation. It is closed at the moment, but will reopen the first weekend in December. Why that's happening soon, I've got a lot to do. What I decided to do was to take this opportunity to offer visitors a look at how traditional themes and subjects and motifs continue to inspire Japanese art in the present day, and in that way to complement the exhibition called Mr. that recently opened here at Phoenix Art Museum. Now, most of us realize from coming to Phoenix Art Museum and travel and such that in the study of global cultures and histories, it's apparent that most have blended their past and their present traditions, but also absorbed external cultures and transformed them in ways that then become a part of their own culture. So it's from this perspective that we'll be offering a glimpse of how this has occurred within the last 2 centuries, primarily in Japan. A pivotal moment in time was 1863, when American Commodore Perry entered Japan and broke its isolation of 3 centuries. So the influx of new ideas in Japan at that time impacted all aspects of Japanese life and culture. The first part of the new exhibition we're going to talk about briefly is this one of Japanese cloisonné enamel. Now, cloisonné is clearly not a Japanese word, it is a French word, because this technique began long ago in Europe, and from there it spread through the Middle East to China and Japan, particularly during the time of Islam. What is cloisonné enamel? Let's look at some examples. Here's some from the 18th century. Utilizing very fine wires and repeated application of glass paste, cloisonné artists create richly colored surface patterns on a variety of metal and occasionally porcelain objects. You can see on the right that cloisonné is being done on blue and white porcelain, for example. In works from the 19th and 20th century, cloisonné peaked in terms of its techniques on the island nation, and the wares became a successful export. Notice here on the right how the Japanese artists have created that background texture that we refer to as tree bark, which gives it a very subtle and natural kind of experience, not so bright and shiny. And then we move on to world fairs, when Japan began participating in these global cultural events, and many Westerners began to collect cloisonné enamel. And Japanese culture then became appreciated by more people, and likewise, Japanese artists became influenced by Western tastes. More examples, a little sort of botanical naturalism on the right, and then as we move towards the 20th century, a distinctly modern flavor. And a very modern flavor here. Then this one is said to be a cityscape, really the movement and light and dazzle. All of these are in our permanent collection, will be on view in just a few weeks. Now, what else are we going to offer you? Let me tell you briefly about our prints and masks of Japan's No Theater. Some of the major themes of No Theater include the interrelationship between humans, animals, and spirits, phenomena seen and unseen, the mysteries of the past, the present, and the future, and the imaginative creation of superhuman and fantasy characters to provide protection in times of catastrophe. Notice that some of those themes overlap closely with themes in the Mr. exhibition. What is No Theater? Well, in going back to the mid-14th century, that was a while ago, there's an amalgamation of religious performance, popular dance, and music that were fused into a coherent whole. And with the patronage of the nobility and the shogunate, No, which means solemn drama, drew upon historical tales, Buddhist and Shinto stories, and classical poetry. During the 17th and 19th century, the performances became refined and standardized. The drama is complemented by a small group of musicians and a simple stage set. A few props suggest various settings in the realm of the living and the dead. For example, on the left, that little structure that they're standing in is said to represent a boat. They are on a boat. All of these prints are by the artist Kogyo, a late 19th century woodblock print artist who began focusing almost exclusively on no theater after he saw performance as a youth. The dynamism of his prints reflects his knowledge of the aesthetics and the conventions of performance, capturing the color and movement of this stylized theatrical art form, which remains viable and popular today. If you're in Japan, it's likely that you'll be taken to a kabuki performance, which is more lively with theatrics and acrobatics. No is more subtle and slow-moving, kind of like Shakespeare is to us. Those who follow no performance speak of being able to perceive a mask come alive, or breathe during a masterful performance. Part of the artistry of a mask lies in understanding the play of light and the tilt of the mask on the wearer's face during the performance to create a wealth of different expressions. These are subtleties it takes a while to appreciate. Today there are over 200 different types of masks, and this gives you an idea of the range of expressions. And some of them could be used for similar characters in different plays. Keep in mind that up until about the 20th century, all no actors were male, and so the art, of course, the mask was a crucial, important part of performance to play female characters. Very expressive and sometimes a bit frightening. Now, the part I really want to focus on today that connects very well with the second lecture that we're going to hear this afternoon is that called Beauty and Function, Japanese folk art from the Meiro Strelitz collection. These objects do not yet belong to Phoenix Art Museum, but are in a private collection in Tucson and have never been publicly shown before. So we're honored and delighted to offer them to the public for the first time, and to learn a little bit more about Japanese folk art, something we've not presented at the museum in the 22 years I've been here. What is Japanese folk art? Well, everyday objects of traditional Japanese life. That includes a lot of different kinds of things. A reverence for natural materials and an aesthetic of rusticity, simplicity, and elegance. These are examples of firemen's coats. I've been told I should change this to firefighter to be politically correct. I'm sorry, in the 19th century, Japanese firefighters were all men. And notice that in these firemen's coats, let's talk about these a little bit close up. And up until the 20th century, most architecture in Japan was made out of wood, very vulnerable to fires, lots of fire disasters. And so, firemen were great heroes. Following a disaster, there would be a celebratory recognition of what these men had done to save people from disaster and death. So these coats serve two purposes. They are made of a heavy quilted cotton. When the firemen were fighting the fires, they would be soaked wet and worn that way in the fire to provide water resistance. And the designs that you're seeing here would be turned to the inside, so you can see the plain jacket. After the fire was successfully fought, there would be a ceremonial event that would take place to honor the firemen, and then they would turn the coats, which we assume by then had dried out, to the side with these wonderful protective deities and mythological figures that, of course, it was believed would provide protection for the firefighters during the actual fire. Oh, I wanted to mention one more thing about these. The technique that's used here, we're going to see a variety of textile techniques in this exhibition, is a freehand resist dye technique with the addition of hand painting. And some of these were derived from woodblock prints. Let me say that I tried to do some direct connections between the images on these coats and specific woodblock print artists, but that was quite a challenge. I'm still working on that. And all of these examples date from the 19th century. What else do we have? Well, futon covers, a very essential item. As many of us know, in traditional Japanese homes, some of which are still in use today, people sat and slept on the floor. Furniture was minimal. The floor would be covered in tatami mats. You can see tatami matting in the Asian gallery in the Tokonoma alcove that we have. Furniture was quite minimal. You'd have some storage chests, perhaps for your clothing, and a low table, so when you sat on the floor, you could put your food on that table. Futons made of wadded cotton, and I think many of us have seen, if not slept on a futon, served as mattresses that could be placed on the floor at night for sleeping, and then folded neatly up and put into your cupboard during the daytime. So you didn't need a bunch of different rooms for different functions. One room would do very nicely. If you go to Japan and stay in a traditional Japanese inn, you can relive that kind of experience. Yes, your room will be a sitting room by day, a sleeping room by night. All you have to do is roll your futon up and put it in the cupboard. Now, what you covered your futon with would convey various kinds of wishes. What might those include? Well, first of all, they might be made of silk or cotton, but they depicted themes with motifs that represented wonderful and positive wishes. That includes things like prosperity, conjugal harmony, healthy children, good fortune, and even objects related to the tea ceremony. These examples also date from the 19th century, and we will have one or both of these on view very soon. Notice the children dominate on the left-hand corner. It refers to what would be going on the futon that might result in that. What else is in this lovely Tucson collection that's generously offering us the opportunity to learn more about Japanese art? By the way, I'll just offer you a little backstage aside here. We've been rebuilding our staff here at the museum, and I'm looking forward to meeting our new photographer. But you'll notice in some of these photographs, such as the one on the right, see that purple hand there? That's a staff hand wearing a nitrile glove. And this is an informal photograph, not a professionally taken photograph. But I think we did quite well. So shop signs, when you think about it, in many cultures, would have had to reach out to an audience that was not necessarily literate. Universal education in most societies is a fairly recent phenomenon. So, if you have people who are not literate and you want to bring them in as customers, your signs would then show a picture of what it is you're offering for sale. These would make very good guessing games with children in the gallery, for example. If you're a grandparent, a parent, or a museum docent, I see some of them in the audience today. On the right, for example, that would be a shop selling combs. And on the left, for example, that would be a shop selling paint, different colors. Notice it looks almost like a paint palette. What else you see here is that Japanese aesthetic for rusticity, for appreciating the natural aging of works of art. These are carved out of wood and painted. Now, it would be a strong temptation, curators feel this, to want to do some conservation work on these wooden objects, and then maybe doing a little painting touch up to make them look a little fresher. But no, no. That kind of restraint needs to be exercised when we're looking at objects like this, because they are part of the Japanese aesthetic in that they show their wear and their age, and that makes them even more beautiful than when they were fresh and new. And then kimono. Now many of us probably think, well, I know what a kimono is. Maybe you have one at home, one or two at home, even in your closet, yes. The word kimono actually means thing to wear. Mono is thing. A kimono is a thing to wear. A tabemono is a thing to eat. So you take a verb and you put it in the word thing, and then you are describing a category of something. And it applies to many different kinds of garments worn traditionally in Japan by people of all ages and all genders. The kimono is a marvel because it adapts to changes in sizes in the human body. Unlike European tailoring, which, you gain a few, you lose a few, you go through pregnancy or whatever, and then you have to get new clothes. I think this was a scheme on the part of perhaps fabric merchants and tailors. But in Japan, you can wear a garment for a lifetime. You just wrap it a little more tightly or a little more loosely, and you have a sash that will wrap around and keep it closed and fit it to your current size. There were types of kimono for special occasions, seasonal wear. There were some made for no performance. And fortunately, the Strelitz Mero collection has one on the left here that is actually made for no theater performance. So we're going to hang it in with the no theater prints and masks, since we have no costumes in our museum collection. Others have dramatic designs that may integrate elements of landscape, auspicious symbols, a variety of patterns, and we'll have examples that include outerwear as well as innerwear or undergarments, or even kimono to sleep in. If you visited Japan, you might have had the opportunity to wear a yukata, which is sort of like a cotton bathrobe, for more informal wear. And then you might have been invited to wear that to dinner and sit on the floor for several hours while you have a lengthy meal of many courses on tiny dishes. That was a fun experience. Here are a few more examples of that, and I think particularly the one on the right speaks to this Japanese aesthetic of simplicity, rusticity, and elegance. It is not flashy colors. It is not even splashy designs like the one on the left. Compare those two together. They're quite different, actually. The Japanese use a lot of indigo dyeing techniques, and then very subtle colors are mixed in with that. The natural background color of the fabric itself, creating the cream color that you see there in contrast to the indigo, and then just a few accents of culture. It's an abstract pattern. What is it? You can think about it. What does it suggest to you? And then we have some really splashy pieces which are going to be on view, like this one, which is a complete horse covering. I'm still learning a little about this. Exactly where and how would it have fit on your horse? And what would you do with your saddle once you have this on your horse? Nevertheless, it is a splendid and very large piece, and you can see here is the use of more exuberant colors. So, and in Japan, there is an aesthetic for every moment. There is an aesthetic for every occasion. And we're going to learn a little bit more about that in relationship to the tea ceremony today. But what I want to do is segue into that a bit and talk about the connection between China and Japan, something I have personally studied a great deal myself. And I'm mostly using examples in our own museum collection, which in a few weeks you can go over and see live in the Asian Gallery. These are examples of, what do you think, Chinese or Japanese? Those are both Chinese. They're really old. About 10th century or so. Very old. And these were made at a time when Buddhism had already arrived in Japan, and the tea ceremony began to be used in China. So these are objects that today look very contemporary, perhaps, to our eye. I think the one on the left, many people have commented to me, looks contemporary. The one on the right is a tea bowl, of course much smaller than the image you see here. And it has a pattern that was achieved by a wonderful technique that creates what we call the oil spot pattern. Wonderfully abstract and wonderfully subtle. Now, once the Chinese mastered these kinds of ceramics, they were exported to Japan along with Buddhist philosophy and Buddhist texts and a whole host of other cultural ideas from China. And the Japanese were just delighted with the aesthetics of these. So simple, so elegant. And even, you'll notice the foot of the vessel on the left is left exposed, reminding us, what are ceramics made of? Clay, dirt, earth, the most basic essential of human creativity throughout the millennia. These two pieces are also on view in the Asian gallery right now and come from a similar time period in China, around the 10th century. Other kinds of spotting techniques that are described by poetic phrases like tortoiseshell and hare's fur. These were wonderfully popular in Japan, so with the tea ceremony came these kind of tea wares from China to Japan, in which they were treasured and used and kept for generations. But then the Chinese did something else. They started on a quest for, here's a word I hesitate to use, but I'll use it, perfection. The quest for ever purer clays, for ever whiter color of glazes, and eventually they achieved what we consider, scientifically as well as artistically speaking, pure white porcelain. An example on the left, which is also on view in the Asian gallery. It has its own kind of beauty, but it's very different from the ones I just showed you. Here you're looking at a feeling of purity and perfection. It's absolutely symmetrical. The glaze is absolutely even in color and texture. As a matter of fact, there's really no texture at all. And then, by about the 14th century, what did the Chinese start doing? They realized that pure white porcelain was like having a blank piece of paper. You could paint pictures on it. And that's exactly what they did. They started painting pictures on it, often with blue pigment, primarily based on cobalt. And a few centuries later, by about 15th century, you get a preponderance of what we famously call blue and white porcelain. It tells whole stories. It's like looking at a book of pictures. Now, these were less appealing to the Japanese, not to say that they didn't like them at all. They were wildly appealing to European and even American tastes. There are examples of porcelain that are made in Japan, even today, in various kiln sites. But suffice it to say that what we see on the right here is the antithesis of what I showed you just a moment ago with the oil spot and the splotches of white on the brown vessel. So, that was the Chinese journey through ceramics. It was the earlier pieces that were treasured in Japan and embraced the kind of aesthetics that we're going to talk about more today and which you've been reading about in the book. Two things we want to talk about. The first one, which I should have put at the top instead of second, are the terms wabi and sabi. Now, I have read a lot about these two terms and talked to a lot of people about them. You can see books. We have some in our museum store about wabi and sabi. One of my former assistants said, oh, Janet, no, wabi and sabi, they're not together. No, those are two very separate concepts. No, don't mix them up. We're Americans. Suffice it to say that both of these terms represent ideas of impermanence. Life is impermanent. People don't like it when I say this, but death is where we are all headed, and everything will disintegrate. Imperfection. Let's take a look at each other. Is anybody here looking perfect today? The closest you can get to observing perfection is to look out at what some people will call God's creation, or the patterns in nature. Extraordinarily perfect compared to what happens to us humans following birth. Incompleteness. If something is missing, that makes it more intriguing. And subtlety, rusticity, and asymmetry. The Chinese loved balance and symmetry in their art. The Japanese said, well, that's a little too close to perfection. Let's make things that are asymmetrical. More interesting that way, slightly off balance. These qualities are admired in art as well as almost every other aspect of life in Japan. The longer you stay in Japan, the more you will realize that is true. Now, the second thing I'm going to mention just briefly here before I conclude and hand over the microphone is another word that I love to occasionally forget. So I put it here so I wouldn't forget it. Kintsugi. What is kintsugi? I encourage you to go home and Google this because you'll see some bizarre phenomena. Originally, it is the art of repairing ceramics by actually highlighting the break after you have glued the missing piece back together again with a little bit of gold or silver. So to emphasize the break, which is seen as increasing its value and its beauty. Don't try to glue everything back together so that you can pretend that the cracks aren't really there. The cracks are there. Make them more beautiful. And so, the Japanese developed the art of kintsugi. And among the many images that are available, and this one is not in our collection, one of the few slides today that I've showed you that is not, and is a piece of ceramics that was very simple and rustic and wabi-sabi to begin with. Notice it has uneven designs and dots and dashes on it. It's rather rustic to begin with, but then it suffered quite a bit of an accident there and had several breaks. And somebody very carefully not only put it back together, but highlighted those breaks with a little bit of gold pigment. And that adds a whole new dimension to that very simple and rustic piece. It's been around for centuries. It just gets more beautiful. So I leave you with that image and with that thought, and we will hear from our next speaker and explore some of these ideas a little further, particularly in regards to tea ceremony. Thank you.
Konnichiwa, actually. I think it's the afternoon almost. Afternoon. My name is Keiko Nakada, and I thank you for allowing me to present what is called Chado, or the way of tea. It is something that is a lifetime study, as many of you know. It's not something that we learn instantly and get the hang of it in 2 days. It's certainly what Senrikyu, who codified this way of life, and in the form, said from 1 to 10 and back again. Today I'm going to show you a full chaji condensed. It usually takes about 4 hours, but it will be condensed into 18 minutes thanks to our technology and I'm very grateful for the loan from the Urasenke Foundation of San Francisco, who did this for their 50th anniversary. They've been in existence probably for over 60 years now, but they are one of our main offices representing the Urasenke tradition. Let's see, what can I talk about? Referring back to Dr. Baker's sense of rusticity, simplicity, and elegance, that is something that we certainly try to achieve as we study this art form. And I like to call it art form because as humans, I think we need something like this on a daily basis to remind us that we are human. Speaking to imperfection, every single time we do a tea, it is never perfect. So thankfully that's acceptable. Let's see what else. If you have ever had any questions about Chado or tea, well, we like to call it Chado, and if you can remember that in the back of your mind, it's Do is, of course, the way. Cha is tea. Chado is the way of tea, and it's a philosophy that encompasses being considerate of each other. And today I have something that is taken from the video that we have, and it's the two characters, Wa and K. And that was something that was highlighted in the film that you are about to see. And Wa is harmony, and they'll explain exactly what it is, but it's the sense of harmony within ourselves, with each other, with nature, with everything that's around us. And then K is respect, to be thankful for what we have, what blessings we may encounter on a daily basis. So with that, and then we have a very simple flower arrangement. I borrowed the yellow flowers. I don't know what they are. If someone knows what it is, please let me know. It was in front of the hotel that I was staying at today. So I said thank you, and here it is. And then the branch is from the Japanese friendship garden persimmon tree. So kind of representing the season outside, we'll bring it in, and then let us look at the film and see what we can take for ourselves as far as being a host, being a guest, and connecting with each other.
Today, Ayaka and her mother have been invited for tea. It will be a chaji, a full tea experience involving all the important facets of Japan's traditional cultural pastime called Chado, the way of tea. This is young Ayaka's first time going to a chaji, and she feels a bit tense. The way of tea became congealed more than 400 years ago, largely owing to Senrikyu. Among other things, it forms the basis for the manners that are important in Japanese society today. This is the invitation letter, which says that their host wants to offer them a dose of tea. Like medicine, a serving of tea is called ippuku, or a dose, deriving from tea's original use as a medicinal potion. Soon, we will see how it also has a wonderful, positive effect on our emotional health. Their host wants to be sure that his guests have a pleasant time, and he puts his heart into the preparations for, as the phrase Ichigo Ichie expresses, this day's encounter, that is, the once-in-a-lifetime experience of each unique encounter of each new day, is very precious to him. Sitting at the Machiai waiting arbor, young Ayaka and her mother too are looking forward to what is to come. Their host comes out to beckon in his guests and greets them silently, saving his words of greeting until his guests are settled in the tea room. The garden path which leads to the tea room is called roshi, meaning dewy ground. It is like a neatly tended spot in nature, and to quietly step along it has a soothing effect. Before reaching the tea room, there is a stone water basin called tsukubai, where the guests rinse their hands and mouth, purifying themselves for entering the tea room. This is the tea room doorway, which is called Nijiriguchi, literally meaning crawl through entrance. Guests have to bow down low and forget about self-pride to enter the tea room. The soft light and faint aroma of incense give the very air a soothing quality. Gently enveloped in them, Ayaka's tension lifts away. The scroll hanging in the alcove relates the host's sentiment and acts in setting the tone for the chaji. So the first thing Ayaka and her mother do is to go up and view it. The host is going to lay charcoal in the hearth for heating the kettle. Ayaka and her mother draw near to watch. This act of building the charcoal fire, too, is a gesture of hospitality. He adds incense, its fragrance being an invisible part of the warm treatment he shows his guests. At a chaji, a meal is served before the tea. It is meant to prepare the guests for the thick tea that is the highlight of the chaji. The style of the meal is called kaiseki. It is a representative style of Japanese cuisine. The foods focus on seasonal ingredients, prepared so their natural flavors can be appreciated and arranged so that they are enchanting to the eye. The sound of the chopsticks gently dropped onto the tray signals to the host that the guests have finished the meal. He thus sets about the next thing, the serving of the sweets. The beautiful sweets are like delectable expressions of the season. It looks like Ayaka is very delighted. The guests then go out to the garden and ready themselves to partake of the tea. This intermission is referred to as nakadachi. During this time, the host opens the windows and removes the reed blinds to allow more sunshine in and vivify the atmosphere in the room. Flowers are like a living calendar, and they add greatly to the sense of season in the tea room. The sound of the gong signals to the guests that the preparations are ready for the tea. The guests listen carefully and compose themselves. The flowers in the alcove are the only living things in the tea room. They are arranged in a very natural fashion, concording with Senriku's teaching that tea room flowers should be as though they are in their natural environment. The koicha temae, or thick tea procedure, is the pivotal event at a chaji. It is a sedate service in which uncalled-for speech is disallowed. Ayaka and her mother are absorbed in watching the flowing movements. A pleasurable feeling of tension pervades the atmosphere. The thick koicha for all the guests is prepared in a single tea bowl, and the guests in turn share it from that one bowl. Through this, there arises a deep sense of unison between the host and guests. The koicha service is followed by the serving of usucha or thin tea. Firstly, some small confections are served. They too are replete with a seasonal feeling. Unlike the koicha, the relatively thin usucha is prepared in individual servings. Also, the mood of this part of the chaji is lighter. The tea bowl is turned to avoid placing one's lips on the front side. This reveals the guest's attitude of consideration towards the tea bowl itself. The articles used for chanoyu are all accorded careful attention and respect. For today's chaji, the host carefully selected each item, thinking about the guests and occasion and season, thus designing and producing the setting and making this event very special. The guests inquire about the items, learning about their makers and discovering their special, often subtle significance for today's ichi no ichie. The host and his guests have made a lovely memory together. Full of gratitude, they bow to each other as the chaji comes to an end. Sanrikyu, who established the way of tea, expressed its ideals through the 4 words, wa, kei, sei, jaku. The attitude of empathy and accord. The attitude of appreciating one's blessings. The ideal of being non-defiled. The spiritual quietude realized when all is harmonious, respectful, and pure. In the tiny space of the tea room, young Ayaka discovered that there was a big and enchanting world. It was like a living lesson in history, art, literature, etiquette, food appreciation, and on and on. She looks forward to what the next opportunity will be like and asks her mother if she can wear kimono next time.
Thank you for your attention to that, and that concludes the presentation at the moment. And are we?
Thank you very much. Are there any questions for either Janet or Keiko Sensei? Yes.
I was just curious, the host didn't participate with his guests. Like, why?
So the interaction is purely as a host and purely as a guest. So we tried to, it's a great question because we tried to distinguish between the two. There is a separation because you have to focus on being one or the other. And so the host would have partaken of all of the meal and everything and tested it prior to this. And this is kind of asking the guests to please join them as guests in continuing to enjoy the day with each other. So, great question. Thank you. That's why.
So I'm curious what part of it would be expanded so that it would last 4 hours? And is there conversation at all?
Yes, the conversation would have, I think you can hear it.
So the 4 hours is really including the entrance of the guests. They would come about 15 minutes prior to the invitation or the invited time. They would place their belongings in a special room that has a basket for everything that they do not need for the tea ceremony. And they will get ready, probably change their tabi if they have tabi, or change into new white socks if you're wearing Western wear. And then you're kind of settling yourself in before everything starts. So that is where the timeline starts. And then you're settled in, you will be invited into a separate room that has perhaps like a heater of some sort, a natural one with usually either of ceramic or wood that has charcoal lit, and then you can warm your hands, especially during this season, from November to April. There is a hibachi, I guess you can call it, and you would warm your hands. There's a place also for the main guest and perhaps 2 other guests usually. We don't have more than 5 guests for a chaji because it would be a long time if we tried to serve everyone. So 4.5 hours is really up to 5 guests. And so you can imagine the exchange of the trays for the meal, the dessert, and so that portion takes usually about 1.5 hours to 2 hours. So that's the main part as far as the long hours. And the dessert is the main sweet that they had at the very end of the first section of the meal. So then they would do nakadachi, which is described there, and that usually takes maybe 10-15 minutes so you can rest your legs. And the host can prepare for the tea portion. So everything for the meal is taken away. The first part of the tea ceremony, the formal tea ceremony, is the theme of the day, which is the tablet or the scroll. And so that's taken up, and then the flower comes into the alcove. So that takes about a good 15 minutes. And then the gong calls you back, and the thick tea can take anywhere from, depending on, again, how many guests we have, 45 minutes to 1 hour. So then you can now imagine the shortest portion is the usuja, which is the dry sweet usually, and it's a thinner tea, so it's easier to drink. Now, this was made prior to COVID, so nowadays for the thick tea especially, we have individual bowls for everyone just to serve. And then of course the usuja, you're supposed to share the one bowl, and that's the oneness feel that we are supposed to have. But nowadays it's a little more of a challenge, so separate bowls for everyone. So 4.5 hours, I think we've covered it.
No, thank you for describing that. It also, I'm guessing, I've never really done the whole 4 hours, but there's long periods, like with the Navajo and all. You can just sit there and not talk. In other words, there's very little talk, right? In other words, the guest knows what to do, the host knows what to do,
Exactly.
and very few words are needed. Just watching that 18 minutes, I almost fell asleep. It was just, it's almost meditative. So the 4 hours, I'd probably fall. I'm saying this
A good
is
sleep, yes.
a good sleep. It just, so thank you. I mean, that was marvelous. You put in, and with what you just said, it's like, wow, I feel like I really have gone through that 4 hours. Thank you.
Good. That's kind of the feel that I wanted, because it's quite a privilege to be invited to a tea. So it of course showcases what we've learned so far, and I've been doing this, oh wow, over 40 years, and I still don't know what I'm doing. So imperfection, yes, I completely agree with that. But it's really the heart that we put into it. Our guests would know, how much of I think somewhere, not in this video, but a gyote sensei, a deputy teacher at Urasenke headquarters, described the feeling of omotenashi, which is, in English, they translated it as mindful hospitality, right? So once we get into that mode, I think everyone can get on board, for lack of a better word. And we're all in the same boat, and we create that moment that ichigo ichi moment. So thank you for that question. Yes.
Any other questions? Great, thank you so much for your
Thank you very
presentation.
much.